Hey folks, it's your buddy Mike Messier here on One Pro Wrestling and Sports Fan YouTube channel. You might be seeing this video on Twitter or Instagram or even LinkedIn. You won't be seeing it on Facebook because I've been banned. Yes, I've been banned from Facebook. So I'm actually kind of happy about it because I put too much time into that platform anyway, and I'm fine with it. I'm really okay with it. I'm okay with my banning. So this video, I'm going to discuss wrestlers that wrestlers, pro wrestlers for the pro wrestling fans, wrestlers that did not appear at WrestleMania 1, but could have, maybe should have, maybe in an alternate Mandela effect universe they did. You might be wondering, well, gee whiz, Mike, that shirt looks very wonderful. Well, you can actually buy this picture of USA guy, as I call him, over on the foreign object spread shirt. Yes, I painted this. This is my original artwork. I made this creation today, which you can see the holes in because I'm using the old background thing. And this one. So this was my 4th of July rendering. All these wonderful artworks. You can look into buying them or not. Or you could just subscribe to One Artist, Mike Messier, over on YouTube and check out my art as it comes out. Now I'm going to discuss WrestleMania 1. For those of you that haven't watched it, I know some of the younger fans, maybe it hasn't even occurred to you that you should watch these old wrestling shows for historical context. How do you know where we're going if you don't know where we've been? So for the young wrestling fans out there, if nothing else, you can see how the sport has evolved, how it's changed. But it's actually a pretty fun show. It's a fun little, tight little show by comparison. You know, this show probably, I just counted the actual match time of all the matches, and it's unbelievable that it's really only about 61 minutes of actual wrestling action with the 9 matches. Like I said, in this video, we're going to discuss some wrestlers who were not on the show but should have been. But just as a refresher, let me bang through the quick 9 matches of what happened at WrestleMania 1 back in 1985. I believe it was March 31st, 1985, Madison Square Garden. Actually, it was a Sunday afternoon show, which is kind of interesting. But Tito Santana defeated the Executioner by submission to the figure 4 leg lock. The Executioner was actually Playboy Buddy Rose underneath the mask. By the way, this is live. If you happen to be awake, 3:32 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on July 8th. This is when I'm doing this. So if you happen to be tuning in live, you can comment in live time. The second match was King Kong Bundy with manager Jimmy Hart before Bundy was, I believe, traded to Bobby the Brain Heenan. I think the missing link was involved in that trade somehow. But basically, King Kong Bundy defeated Special Delivery Jones, SD Jones. They made this thing out to be like a world record of, I think they were saying 6 seconds at the time. It was actually more like a 24-second match, but for whatever reason, they were trying to build it up as being a 6-second record. The third match, I guess that was just to build up Bundy. That was the point. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, I don't think he was even called the Dragon yet, but Ricky Steamboat defeated Matt Bourne. Really should have been a better match. This was another one of these matches that was only about 6 minutes long. Steamboat was really getting the nice push here. He was a newcomer. He had just wrestled at Starrcade 84 back in November in Greensboro, losing a nice match to Tully Blanchard. That's a really underrated match, the Tully Blanchard Ricky Steamboat Starrcade 84 match. Here he is against Matt Bourne. Matt Bourne, I think, could have been pushed a little bit stronger, but he was basically brought in as an underneath guy. It's nice, though, that Matt Bourne got to say he wrestled at WrestleMania 1. I think the next time he would be at a WrestleMania wouldn't be until WrestleMania 9 as a Doink. Okay. The next match is kind of an interesting one. Another wrestler that's kind of been forgotten with time, David Sammartino. Sometimes he was known as Bruno Sammartino Jr., sometimes he was known as David Bruno Sammartino. He had his father with him in the corner, and he went against Brutus Beefcake. He wasn't the barber yet. He was just Brutus Beefcake. What a bunch of names. And I mean, that guy has like 3 gimmick names in one name: Brutus, Beefcake, and then they added the barber in 87. So he had 3 gimmick names. He was with Johnny Valiant back when they were still calling him Johnny Valiant. They would later just call him Johnny V as the manager. And they went to a double disqualification. I believe that Bruno and Johnny Valiant got involved towards the end. That was actually a pretty good match there. It's too bad that David, he was pretty short for a WWF wrestler. They weren't doing the junior heavyweight title very much at the time. I'll get into that later in this video. But it's too bad that David didn't have a better career in general and specifically in the WWF. The next match was the first, I guess you can say that this was the first ever intercontinental title match at a WrestleMania. And I think if we're going in order here, this would be the first ever championship match of any kind at a WrestleMania. Greg Valentine, the Intercontinental Champion, once again with Jimmy Hart. Jimmy Hart, you could say, is the first manager to appear twice at a WrestleMania. But basically, Greg Valentine pinned the Junkyard Dog, but they actually, on the results here in Wikipedia, they failed to mention that Tito Santana came out and talked to the referee, and I believe they reversed the decision. And they restarted the match, and JYD ended up winning by countout. That's at least how I remember this thing. I'm just going by the top of my memory, but the old Wikipedia doesn't have that. So I'm once again correcting the internet, and that's happened before, folks. There's been a lot of times, at least several times, that I've seen stuff, especially about wrestling, online, even on the old WWE network. There was this thing years ago, the WWE network had posted Super Brawl 2, the Sting Lex Luger match, and they had it listed as February 28th, 1992. I told my friend Tommy at the time, I said, that's wrong. The match actually took place on Leap Day, which was February 29th, 1992. My friend didn't believe me that I was correcting the WWE network. He Googled it, and of course I was right. It was February 29th, 1992. But in any regard, I believe the Junkyard Dog ended up winning that match by countout. The next match was also a title match, and this you could say, if we're going in chronological order here, and I believe they are, the first ever title change at a WrestleMania was the tag team title, the WWF Tag Team Championship, when the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov defeated the U.S. Express, Barry Windham, and Mike Rotundo. Once again, a pretty short match. This match was listed at just 6 minutes or something. Really not very long matches on this show. This was actually a pretty damn good tag team match. These two tag teams had a nice feud that year, trading the belts back and forth. The U.S. Express got the belts back from Nikolai and the Sheik, and then they lost them later on to Valentine and Beefcake. But this was a nice match. The Andre the Giant in the Body Slam Challenge match defeated Big John Studd. Wendy Richter regained the women's title from Leilani Kai. This was a nice singles women's match. 2 title changes on this show. And then finally, the main event, what everyone pretty much came to go see. Hulk Hogan and Mr. T with Jimmy Superfly Snuka defeated Paul Mr. Wonderful Orndorff and Roddy Piper with Bob Orton. Muhammad Ali and Pat Patterson are the guest referees. So that's what we did see at WrestleMania 1. Now let's get into some of the people that we did not see at WrestleMania 1. And for this very special occasion, and I did have some new subscribers recently. Gentleman, he could be a gentleman, he could be a woman, who knows. El Questionario, new subscriber. He or she has got a nice YouTube channel with only 8 subscribers, and I'm the 8th one. So if you folks are out there, if you're looking for some wrestling trivia, of course, you've got Pro Wrestling Trivia by Mike Messier on Kindle Vella on Amazon. But also this individual, El Questionario, has got a new YouTube channel that I subscribe to tonight because they've been leaving some good comments, probably getting some trivia from me, which is fine. But I did subscribe, and I will endorse their YouTube channel. And they had a nice thing on the 1988 Royal Rumble, so I did leave a comment on there. So the El Questionario has been leaving some nice comments. You fine folks are welcome to leave some nice comments. And let's get into some of my graphics. So the first group of people that I want to discuss of wrestlers that did not appear at WrestleMania 1 that could have or should have, or in an alternate universe they did. Let's check out this list. This is the people that left the WWF just a little too soon to be included at WrestleMania 1. So we've got the Fabulous Freebirds. I'm not sure if you can still hear me here as I'm talking, but we've got the Fabulous Freebirds, Dr. D, David Schultz, Sergeant Slaughter, the Tonga Kid, the Wild Samoans, Offensica, and Kamala. Let's get back to me. So the Fabulous Freebirds are an interesting case. I looked up and I had a nice website, the history of WWE.com, had some good Madison Square Garden results. And from my readings, basically the Freebirds were in the WWF for a cup of coffee, as they say. The legend goes that Andre the Giant did not like the Freebirds because they were all drunk and stupid. And Andre insisted that they all get fired, which is just a great story. But basically, Terry Gordy, Buddy Roberts, and Michael Hayes were doing this gimmick where they were kind of like the new team managed by Dave Wolf, who was kind of the manager slash boyfriend. I don't know if he ever got married to Cyndi Lauper. I don't think they did, but Dave Wolf was kind of an interesting guy who was kind of in that whole rock and wrestling era. I believe he was one of the producers and the musicians on the original wrestling album back in 1985 that came out, I think, in October or November of 85. But the Fabulous Freebirds were not long for this world. It's really a shame because I think they would have done well had they been around for WrestleMania 1 in some type of six-man tag team match. And it's just too bad that they missed out because I think obviously they did some great stuff in the world class area in Florida and Mid South, UWF, Jim Crockett Promotions, the AWA. So, like I said, it's a Mandela effect. It's a parallel universe. What could have been, what maybe should have been, but the Freebirds did not have their WrestleMania moment. I'm trying to think. I think Michael Hayes wasn't he in the WrestleMania 17 gimmick battle royal? Wasn't Michael Hayes in that? And then they did get inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, I think both Terry Gordy and Buddy Roberts had passed away, so it was left to Jimmy Jam Garvin and Michael P.S. Hayes to kind of get that induction. But it's just too bad the Freebirds never really had, beyond what I just said, a real WrestleMania moment for all the Freebirds, which is unfortunate. Terry Gordy, of course, did do that Executioner thing in '96, and that wasn't very well done. Although I think he got an action figure, didn't he? Get like one of those little Jack's action figures. Okay, so the Freebirds, and who else did I have on that list? I had the Tonga Kid. Let's go in order here. Dr. D. David Schultz, if you listen to the good doctor, he'll tell you that he invented WrestleMania, that, having Mr. T, and David Schultz claims that it was going to be himself and Roddy Piper against Mr. T and Hulk Hogan. And David Schultz has a pretty good story of calling out Mr. T for a fight. But of course, David Schultz was the guy that slapped John Stossel for 2020 on that infamous report. I won't go into the whole thing here, but basically, David Schultz basically was collateral damage, and Vince McMahon got rid of him. Vince McMahon Jr. got rid of Dr. Death, or Dr. D. David Schultz. And interesting, you had Dr. D. David Schultz and Steve Dr. Death Williams. With Dr. D, it was always just Dr. D. David Schultz. And what does D stand for? Death. But they never really called him Dr. Death David Schultz for whatever reason. Just splitting hairs here. And David Schultz never really had a WrestleMania moment. And it's too bad that he never really, the other promotions, Mid-Atlantic or Jim Crockett Promotions or the AWA, never really picked him up. Unfortunately for me, I missed out. He did have a world title match against Ric Flair, I believe, in the summer of 1985 in Warwick, Rhode Island, which I just had no idea that show was going on. I was a pretty small embryo at the time. But in any event, Dr. D. David Schultz did not get to wrestle at WrestleMania. Also on that list, I had Tonga Kid. The Tonga Kid is on that list. He was kind of the avatar or the substitute for Jimmy Snuka in some matches with Roddy Piper. He was very young at the time. The Tonga Kid would grow up and become the Samoan Savage, was kind of the third member of the SST over in the WCW NWA around 1989, 1990. And he was around for quite some time. The Tonga Kid is somebody who's part of that bloodline, the family, with Roman Reigns, Sika, Afa, everybody. Tonga Kid doesn't get discussed a whole lot, but he kind of peaked too soon. So it's too bad for him that he wasn't around for WrestleMania. I think he was in Continental, believe it or not, wrestling in a babyface six-man team called the Rat Patrol. It was the Tonga Kid, I want to say Scott Armstrong and Johnny Rich. They were actually called the Rat Patrol, and the gimmick was Johnny Rich, R, Scott Armstrong, A, and Tonga T Kid. So they call themselves the RAT Patrol. Funny. And who else did I have on there? I think I had Sergeant Slaughter. Sergeant Slaughter, of course, it's a story you've probably heard. Sergeant Slaughter had an offer from Hasbro to become a GI Joe spokesman slash action figure. The WWF, Vince McMahon, had just signed with LGN for the wrestling LGN figures, and Vince did not want Slaughter to work for at a competing toy company, so they had a falling out, and the Sarge left under really bad terms, and he wouldn't be back until SummerSlam 1990. So the Sarge, kind of went into wrestling, the non-WWF areas, Pro Wrestling USA, the AWA. He had something called the America's Championship for Pro Wrestling USA. And so a sad story, but basically Sergeant Slaughter was not there. Who else did I have on that list? Afa and Sika, the Wild Samoans, they were WWF mainstays for many years. They were 3-time World Tag Team Champions. Of course, Sika just passed away. That's Roman Reigns' father. But basically, the Wild Samoans were just coming off a kind of an interesting babyface turn. They had turned babyface against Murdoch and Adonis, the WWF Tag Team Champions. And for whatever reason, by the time we got to WrestleMania here in March of '85, I think the Samoans had just left like a month earlier. So it's kind of too bad because the Samoans were such a fun tag team. I mostly knew them as heels, but even as baby faces, I think they really would have. I think it would have been nice to have the Wild Samoans on the show, and they just weren't. And then finally on the list, I think I had one more. Oh, Kamala. So Kamala had been there. He was kind of one of these guys that went back and forth to all the territories. And he had been in the WWF for the first time in the late summer of '84. I don't know if they got him matches with Hogan during that run. I know in '87, after WrestleMania 3, Kamala wrestled Hogan a bunch of times. But Kamala did not get a match at WrestleMania 1. I don't think he was at 2. I don't think he was at 3. I think the first time good old Kamala wrestled at a WrestleMania, I don't think he got a WrestleMania match in '92 or '93, unless I'm forgetting something, because he did wrestle Undertaker at SummerSlam '92. I think his first WrestleMania match was that gimmick battle royal at WrestleMania 17. So sad that Kamala did not get a WrestleMania match until past his prime. So there we have the guys that were not at WrestleMania 1 because they had left. But wait, there's more. Let's check out this list. This is a list of guys that showed up in the WWF basically in the months and weeks that followed WrestleMania 1, but they missed the boat by just a few months. So here we have Randy Macho Man Savage, we have Terry Funk, and we have the Missing Link. And there's other guys that we could put on that list, but this is who I have. Savage, Funk, and the Link. So Randy Savage came in, once again, going to that history of the WWE.com. We had those three gentlemen. Savage came in for June at Madison Square Garden. Funk came in for July, and I think the Missing Link was also there in June, and that's just at MSG. So they could have been on other shows in the WWF before those months. But basically, those three guys just missed it by a few months. And I was just thinking about this today before I did this video. It's interesting that the WWF expansion, like really a vital time for Vince and all those Pat Pattersons to get more talent into the WWF, was basically after WrestleMania 1 and before WrestleMania 2. Even if you look at the scope of the WrestleMania 2 card, they had that 20-man battle royal. They had 3 different venues. They had Terry and Dory Funk. They had George Wells, Jake the Snake Roberts, Randy Macho Man Savage, Uncle Elmer. They had a lot of guys at WrestleMania 2 that weren't at WrestleMania 1. Macho Man Savage probably being the most prominent, and the Bulldogs, and a lot of people. So, I mean, I think in that year, from 85, April of 85, basically until April of 86, they just loaded up on talent. And those three guys, I'll just show the names real quick. Macho Man, Terry Funk, and Missing Link. Those three guys were not at WrestleMania 1 because they missed it by that much. Okay, let's go to this is a list of people that were actually at WrestleMania in some capacity, but they did not actually have their own matches because they were in the corner of somebody else. So let's check out this list. So we see Fabulous Moolah, Bruno Sammartino, Superfly Snuka, and Cowboy Bob Orton. Pretty self-explanatory there. Any of those four individuals, it's interesting because Fabulous Moolah would actually, by the time we got to WrestleMania 2, she was actually defending the title, I believe, against Velvet McIntyre. I believe that match was in Chicago. I think in the second or third match on the Chicago show. I think the second. Bruno Sammartino, like we said, he was in the corner of his son. I guess you could put Johnny Valiant, but he was pretty much done with wrestling by this point. But Johnny V or Johnny Valiant was in the corner of Brutus Beefcake. Kind of a nice for the fans like my buddy Nikita Breznikov. I've been reading his book When It Was Real. Bruno and Johnny V or Johnny Valiant in the corner because those guys had wrestled a lot against each other in the 70s. And then you had who else did I have in that list? Cowboy Bob Orton, of course, was in Piper's Corner at both WrestleMania 1 and WrestleMania 2. And Cowboy Bob, I think he only had one official WrestleMania match at WrestleMania 3 with Don Morocco in the opener against the Can-Am Connection, Martel and Tom Zank. Did Cowboy Bob wrestle in that WrestleMania 17 gimmick battle royal? I don't think he did. But he was there at WrestleMania 21 with his son in his son's corner against The Undertaker. But Cowboy Bob never had a singles match at WrestleMania unless I'm forgetting something, folks. And I don't think he was in the WrestleMania 4 Battle Royal. I think he was gone by then as well. So interesting. And let's move on. Superfly Snuka, I should say. Superfly Snuka, you would think as popular as he was, he'd actually have a match at WrestleMania, but instead he was put in the corner with Mr. T and Hulk Hogan. He was the corner man for those guys to kind of balance out Cowboy Bob. So it's just kind of sad that Jimmy Snuka, he did come back to the WWF for WrestleMania 5, but he was just kind of introduced to the crowd. And then at WrestleMania 6, I believe that's when he came back, and I think he lost a match to somebody at WrestleMania 7. I believe Snuka lost to The Undertaker, and at WrestleMania 6, I believe Snuka lost to someone. I'm just kind of blanking on it right now who he lost to. It wasn't DiBiase. Was it Mr. Perfect? Did Kurt Hennig beat Superfly Snuka at WrestleMania 6? I'm just kind of having a little Messier moment here. But in any event, let's move on to the next list. Here are three tag teams that I'll get into it, but here's three tag teams that if things had just been a little bit different with the timing, they could have all been at WrestleMania 1. The British Bulldogs, the Hart Foundation, and the Killer Bees. Three great tag teams of the era. They all missed it. So let's start with the top. The British Bulldogs actually debuted at Madison Square Garden 3 weeks after WrestleMania. Once again, if you look at this website, the history of WWE.com, pretty fascinating that I believe the date was April 22nd, 1985. The Bulldogs had their Madison Square Garden debut 3 weeks after WrestleMania 1. They beat a couple of, a couple of undercard guys. But it's just too bad that they weren't able to be assembled just a month earlier because, that would have been nice to have the Bulldogs at the first WrestleMania. I think it would have been a great showcase for them. And I do feel like some of these matches, especially, no offense to Tito Santana and the Executioner, but I mean, that match easily could have been replaced by a Bulldogs match. Steamboat and Matt Bourne. I mean, if Matt Bourne had been pushed a little bit harder, the Beefcake Sammartino, David Sammartino, they were really pushing for David, but I just, I would have liked to have seen the Bulldogs on this show. The other team, the Hart Foundation, weren't really together quite yet, so you can't blame, the WWF or Vince or anybody. It just was a timing issue. But interestingly enough, both Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart were both in the WWF at the time of WrestleMania 1. I don't think they were a team yet. They could have, if things had played out a little bit differently, who knows? They could have actually wrestled each other. They could have had a Bret Hart versus Jim Neidhart match pre Hart Foundation, if they wanted to push Jim Neidhart, but apparently they didn't. And then the third team, also, I found out that the Killer Bees did not team in the WWF together, jumping Jim Brunzell and B. Brian Blair from Tampa, Florida, Brunzell from, I believe, Minnesota. They did not team together until June. I believe it was June 17th. I think they beat I want to say they beat Dave Barbie, who was a big jacked up guy, and it might have been Steve Lombardi was the other guy. But basically, the Bees weren't even a tag team yet. So really, the only team that you could really make a real case for would have been the Bulldogs, But in any event, none of those three teams are there. Now, here's a list that is probably the most painful for the guys that are on this list, because these are guys that were working in the WWF. They were in the World Wrestling Federation. They were wrestling. And for whatever reason, they just were not booked. And I'll get into some of the possible explanations, but we'll just see the list right now. So we've got Rocky Johnson, Tony Atlas, Ken Patera, Adrian Adonis, Magnificent Morocco, and Pedro Morales. Kind of a good list here. So of that list, let's start with Ken Patera, because I think Ken Patera was in the middle of this Big John Studd, Bobby Heenan, Andre the Giant angle. He was actually in the match where the infamous incident where Big John Studd, and it was Ken Patera and Bobby Heenan who cut Andre the Giant's hair. But by the time the feud really got going, Ken Patera was in legal trouble, for something that he did before he even got back to the WWF. A couple of years earlier, him and Mr. Saito had a fight with police when they were both in the AWA. And Ken Patera, I guess, was just waiting for this court case or this lawsuit or whatever it was with Minnesota police to happen. But basically, he started up with the WWF, and then it finally caught up to Ken, and Ken had to go to jail for a few years. But basically, Andre was feuding not with just Big John Studd, but also with Ken Patera. And in a roundabout way, King Kong Bundy kind of took Ken Patera's place in that feud. But yes, Ken Patera was involved. In fact, I believe in May of '85, Andre the Giant had a singles match against Ken Patera. So it's interesting that Ken was there. He was there at the time. I don't even think he showed up in the corner. I mean, you would think that he would just be in the corner of Big John Studd or make some type of appearance at least, because Ken Patera was pretty prominent in the WWF at the time of the situation. But no, Ken Patera was not, as by my memory, he was nowhere to be seen on camera, at least for WrestleMania 1, which is too bad for him. The other guys, I'd be interested, that show Young Rock, I really didn't get into it because of all the historical inaccuracies. I mean, they had something like Hillbilly Jim and Ric Flair as a tag team in Hawaii. That never happened, Rock. Sorry. I mean, I get it that the Polynesian wrestling had a lot of interesting bookings, but the Rock and the historical inaccuracies on the Young Rock, I couldn't really watch that show. A friend of mine, a non-wrestling fan who was just a fan of The Rock, was always telling me how insightful this show was about wrestling. And I just had to laugh politely at her, because The Rock, his show, The Young Rock, is like a wrestling show for non-wrestling fans. It's just goofy, misinformation. But in any event, God, I do feel. Oh, there was one episode where Rocky Johnson, The Rock's father, was upset that he wasn't booked for WrestleMania, and I believe that story might have had some truth to it, is what I'm getting at. So I think that as much as I say that The Rock's show, Young Rock, was historically inaccurate, I do feel like he had some things that were somewhat in the ballpark of truth. And in any event, Rocky Johnson and his buddy Tony Atlas, his on again, off again tag team partner, former tag team champions, they were not on the show. but they were both in the territory at the time. So that's kind of unfortunate. I think I also had Pedro Morales, who at that time they used to call him Mr. Everything in the World Wrestling Federation. At least that's what Gorilla Monsoon used to say. And but yeah, Pedro, uh, who was still a pretty top guy. I mean, he was kind of a guy on the downside. He started to lose more matches around 86 or so, but I think Pedro could have been on WrestleMania. I'll get into some possible matches for Pedro. And who else did I have on that non-booked list? So Adrian Adonis is kind of an interesting thing. He had just been part of that tag team. I think they were called the East-West Connection. It was or the North-South Connection, or the North. Because he had two things. It was Adonis and Jesse Ventura, I think, were the East-West Connection. So what were Adonis and Murdoch? Was it like the East-South Connection, or the whatever it was? Uh, it might have been the East. I don't know. It was just all these connections, right? So I mean, because Murdoch, I guess you would say, was from the South. So were they called the North-South Connection? I got to get this thing figured out now, because now I'm getting upset, because I know that Adonis was the East-West Connection, but what did they call they call them the North-South Connection. So that Adonis and Murdoch were the North-South Connection, and I guess Adonis and Ventura were the East-West Connection. So I guess Adonis represented both the North and the East. Fair enough. So Adonis was not, Murdoch had left, basically. Murdoch was gone from the WWF. But Adonis was still around, and he was kind of doing his leather gimmick again, like the leather jacket. And he had like this suitcase that said something. It had like a woman's name on it, like Mandy or something, or it wasn't Irene, but like Adonis had this weird gimmick where he had like this suitcase and it had a woman's name on it. Like if you go back to the Wrestling Classic, the first ever pay-per-view, Adonis is on that. And was it Mandy, or was it Gertrude or something? But in any event, Adrian Adonis was not on WrestleMania 1, and he could have been. And then finally, really an interesting case here, Magnificent Morocco, who I really am a fan of, especially as his heel work, especially 1983 was just great Don Morocco stuff. It's too bad, because the way that Morocco explained it, he was actually booked to wrestle Hulk Hogan at Madison Square Garden 3 times for the WWF title after WrestleMania 1. And he said that they kept him off, Vince Jr. kept him off WrestleMania 1 as, to have like a thing where, where Magnificent Morocco could just wrestle at WrestleMania, post WrestleMania, and be something fresh. So like he wasn't at WrestleMania because they were saving him for the house shows at Madison Square Garden to wrestle Hogan, which does make sense. But I feel like they could have had Morocco wrestle at WrestleMania 1 in order to build him up as a top challenger. I mean, that to me makes more sense. But in any event, Morocco was not there. And did I have one other name on this list? No, that's about it. So let's go on to the mid-card maniacs. Now, these are guys that probably, had they been booked at WrestleMania 1, they would have lost. And basically what we're looking at is possible substitutions or possible alternate choices for the Executioner spot, the Playboy Buddy Rose spot, losing to Tito, or S.D. Jones spot, losing to Bundy, or the Matt Bourne spot, losing to Steamboat. So this list is guys that could have put somebody else over. We got Chief Jay Strongbow, Tony Gurria, Salvatore Balemo, Johnny Rods, and Iron Mike Sharp. So these are guys that did not wrestle at WrestleMania. Now, that list, I would say, is probably the list that I feel like I don't necessarily have a case for any of those guys per se. I mean, I think that that Playboy Buddy Rose as the Executioner was actually a pretty good choice, because for a guy that was a little bit chubby, Buddy Rose could really move around pretty quickly. I don't know if Iron Mike Sharp or even Johnny Rodz, as good as Johnny Rodz, could they have done that upbeat tempo match that Buddy Rose did as the Executioner? I don't know. I mean, they're very competent wrestlers. I'm talking about Johnny Rodz and Iron Mike Sharp, but they weren't known for like their fast type of things. They're more known like for milking a match. You know what I mean? For milking an opening match. Iron Mike Sharp did great ring work. Johnny Rodz was awesome, but he was more like a main event preliminary guy, if that makes any sense. Like Johnny Rodz was typically going to 20-minute draws as an opener. And if you look at this WrestleMania card, most of the matches were about 6.5 minutes. So I just don't think that I would really push for a change. I mean, Chief Jay Strongbow or Tony Gurria, either one of them could have done the honors to Bundy. But I kind of think like everything worked out okay on that end. Now I have the miscellaneous list. We are getting close to the end of this video, folks. So here's the miscellaneous. Hillbilly Jim was injured. The national anthem could have been Prince, Kerry Von Erich, and Tony Inoki. Yeah. I'll let you catch up a little bit. So in my research here, I discovered that I was always kind of curious, like when did Hillbilly Jim get injured? And I always thought for some reason it was after WrestleMania 1. It was actually before. Apparently, it was February 25th in San Diego, and it's kind of a sad story because Hillbilly slipped on some water outside the ring in San Diego at like the San Diego Arena. He was wrestling Beefcake, but Beefcake actually didn't injure Hillbilly Jim. There was like a wet spot, like maybe somebody spilled a soda or some condensation, and Hillbilly Jim broke his leg pretty badly, and he was on the shelf for like 7 or 8 months. So he missed WrestleMania by about a month. And I got to think that if Hillbilly hadn't been injured, he probably would have been at WrestleMania and probably would have won some type of match. I could see him maybe he would have gotten the title shot at Valentine, or maybe he would have been in the corner of Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. But in any event, Hillbilly Jim did not get a match at WrestleMania because he was on the shelf. The question mark I had for Prince, yes, I'm talking about Prince of the Revolution. I wish I could find it. I just spent about 10 minutes looking for the video, but somebody here on YouTube, if that person happens to see this, feel free to leave your link in the comments. But someone had made a video speculating that it might have been Prince who was originally booked to sing the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner at WrestleMania 1. Apparently, the WWF had been advertising the special guest celebrity would sing the national anthem. It turned out to be Mean Gene Okerlund, because whoever the guest was a no-show, and this person did a really nice case that it might have been good old Prince, and it really made sense. So I wish I could find that video and link it for you, but I just, like I said, I wasn't going to stay up all night looking for it. I put the search into the YouTube. I searched my video history because I just watched this video 3 or 4 days ago, but I couldn't find it. So whoever's making that video, you got to put your keywords and your title into your keyword stuff. Go to MikeMessier.com and get TubeBuddy if you don't know what I'm talking about here. But in any event, it could have been Prince. And who else did I have on that list? I had international stars. Antonio Inoki had just wrestled at Madison Square Garden like 3 or 4 months earlier against Dr. D. David Schultz, believe it or not, in February. I believe that was the show where Schultz, slapped John Stossel in the dressing room. So Antonio Inoki, apparently in New Japan Pro Wrestling, were kind of in the middle of falling out with the Vince McMahon and the WWF. But it's too bad because Inoki, he could have really been good on this show. And I did say Kerry Von Erich as well, because, we all know that Vince McMahon had a real hard-on in a good way for the Von Erichs, especially Kerry. This would have been a year after Kerry had kind of won and lost, or 10 months after he had won and lost the NWA World title to Ric Flair. And I think Kerry, if Vince wanted to put out an olive branch or try to get the Von Erichs over there, even though they were still technically with the NWA, I think it could have happened. And I think, if Vince really wanted to get those Von Erichs back when they were at full force or close to full force, David had already passed away, but you still had Kerry with both of his feet intact. You still had Kevin. You still had Mike. And I think that this would have been a nice way to have done that. But I think Vince had so much talent right now to worry about. He didn't necessarily have to make a big push for the Von Erichs. In fact, I think a lot of wrestlers, once they saw how successful WrestleMania 1 turned out to be, that's when more and more guys started coming over. So I can see what was going on there, perhaps. And then who else did I have on that could have been list? Oh, the junior heavyweights. So if you look at the bottom of that list, I had listed the Cobra or Black Tiger or Tiger Mask because basically there is this kind of infamous junior heavyweight title match that's on one of the WWF best of tapes. And I kept thinking it was Tiger Mask. It wasn't Tiger Mask because there's another match from like 83 with Tiger Mask. And of course, there was like four different guys who were the Tiger Mask, right? But you had the Cobra and you had the Black Tiger who were fighting for the junior heavyweight title, I think 3 or 4 months before WrestleMania in MSG, and the Cobra won the match. And I do feel like those guys could have had a nice rematch at WrestleMania. And like, once again, they could have taken the Tito Executioner spot, or they could have taken the Steamboat Matt Bourne spot, but they didn't, and that's fine. But I think, like, if you look at the ECW barely legal booking, fast forwarding 12 years to that pay per view where you had that Michinoku Pro 6-man tag team match, I feel like it does add something to a major card when you have like a non sequitur international match, just to kind of extend the olive branch and just to show that there's more wrestling out there. I mean, that's what I like when shows do something like that. But that really wasn't the Vince way. This was Vince celebrating all things New York, celebrating all things WWF. So I get that. And but at the same time, that was an officially recognized WWF Junior Heavyweight title. Although once again, it was kind of in and out. And I do feel that they had a match, according to the history of WWE.com, that the Cobra wrestled Black Tiger like a month or two after WrestleMania in a rematch at Madison Square Garden. Okay, folks, now we're coming to the finale here. And you might be saying, well, gee whiz, Mike, all these wrestlers that you're thinking could have been a WrestleMania 1, but what would you have done with them? What could we have done with these fucking wrestlers? And I'm going to give you the wonderful answer. These are some matches that we could have had at WrestleMania 1 using all the talents we just talked about, plus one more special name. So let's check this out. I don't know if you can hear me, but Johnson and Atlas versus the Wild Samoans in a rematch. That would have been nice. Morocco could have gotten a push over Pedro or Rocky Johnson. The Bulldogs and the Hart Foundation have the timing. The Cobra versus Tiger Mask, Inoki versus Tatsumi Fujinami, Kerry Von Erich versus Ken Patera, The Missing Link versus Chief Jay Strongbow, David Schultz versus Tony Atlas, and I had one other match there. But basically, I'll revisit that list in a second. But if you see, going back to what I said about the tag team thing, you could have had the Hart Foundation versus the Bulldogs versus the Bees versus the Hart Foundation. Had the timing been a little bit better. The Morocco thing I stand by. If you're going to push Morocco as a top contender to Hogan, he had a nice feud with Rocky Johnson for the Intercontinental title a year and a half earlier. They could have revisited that. Morocco could have gotten a solid victory over Rocky, or for that matter, a solid victory over Pedro, because Pedro and Morocco had some classic battles for the Intercontinental title, really hard-hitting matches. Who else did I have on that match? Oh, yeah, the Ken Patera, Kerry Von Erich. That's kind of an inspired choice. If they would have gone ahead and gotten Kerry Von Erich on this show, and this is just magical thinking, hypothetical stuff, but I mean, him and Ken Patera, I believe, had a history for the Missouri State title, which was a National Wrestling Alliance championship. So I think that Kerry and Ken could have had a really great match, even with the time considerations. They could have had an 8 or 9 minute match. Kerry, and I think you'd have to put Kerry over, and maybe Kerry could have come in as backup to Andre the Giant against Patera and Stud. The Cobra versus Tiger Mask, and Antonio Inoki versus Tatsumi Fujinami. If you're wondering, well, why did you put Tatsumi Fujinami on there? He's actually listed as having appeared at Madison Square Garden like the month or two after WrestleMania, so it would make sense for him to wrestle Inoki once again as like an exhibition Japanese showcase match, or Tiger Mask versus the Cobra, I think would have been awesome for the junior heavyweight title. Here's one at the bottom, a couple. Let me start with this 6-man tag. Okay, so we have all these, Steamboat had a singles match. He beats Matt Bourne. Tito Santana beats the Executioner. How about this? How about team up Ricky Steamboat, Tito Santana, put Jimmy Snuka in the mix with those guys, and have them get a victory over Johnny Rodz, Iron Mike Sharp, and George the Animal Steel. Now, I didn't put the Animal on this list earlier, but I think, George the Animal Steel and two guys that were basically underneath guys that were still well respected. Johnny Rodz, Iron Mike Sharp, and George the Animal Steel. And in this match, if they had lost to Steamboat, Santana, and Snuka, it's a nice showcase for all the good guys. And also, they can start planting seeds for George Steele to turn babyface. Because if you remember at the first ever Saturday night's main event, the first match ever on a Saturday night's main event was George the Animal Steel having a babyface turn when he teamed with Nikolai Volkov and the Iron Sheik against Ricky Steamboat, Barry Windham, and Mike Rotundo. So I think that this could have planted the seeds for that. Like, they could have had this match and then just put everything on ice with George Steele until the first Saturday night's main event. But they could have done a thing where, like, George Steele gets confused, or maybe like Iron Mike Sharp and Johnny Rodz abandon George Steele. And I think that's kind of what happened at the Saturday night's main event thing. But I mean, my point is, they could have planted some seeds and had George Steele on the losing end of this match with these job guys. And then when they did the Saturday night's main event thing, it could have been a continuation of that. So I think that would have been a nice payoff. And then you would have condensed the Steamboat and Santana showcase matches, and you would have thrown a bone to Jimmy Snuka, because then he get to wrestle in the match, and he could still be in the corner of Hogan and Mr. T at the end. So there you go. And then what did I have at the bottom? I think I had David Schultz. Let me go back to that one. Yeah, the David Schultz thing. So Dr. D, David Schultz, like I said, if he hadn't been blackballed or, outcast from the WWF to this point, he did have a lot of like racism in his character. I mean, if you look at some of the footage of him doing house show promos, it really was pretty distasteful, like the David Schultz stuff. And I guess you could say that of that era, it was a little, I wouldn't say acceptable, but it was just more, I don't know, common, or people just didn't think about it as much, or maybe because there wasn't a prevalence of social media and stuff like that to kind of catch people on this stuff. And it was wrestling. That's the other thing. It was wrestling. So, but David Schultz and Tony Atlas would have been a really good match. And Tony Atlas was a very entertaining guy. You know what I mean? He still is, actually. So I think that David Schultz and Tony Atlas, they did have some tag team matches. Piper and Schultz, or Piper and Orndorff against Atlas and Johnson, was on the house show circuit. And then finally, I think I had the missing link. The missing link against Chief J Strongbow, just to get Strongbow on this show, I think would have been nice, even in a losing effort against the missing link, who came in, I believe, managed by Bobby Heenan, and he wasn't too long for the WWF. The Johnson and Atlas versus the Samoans match, I think, would have been awesome. It would have been a rematch of the tag team title change from a year earlier, when Johnson and Atlas had beaten the Samoans. And yeah, I know that I said the Samoans were kind of baby faces a little bit, but I think they could have easily, been heelish against Johnson and Atlas, and they could have had this thing as like a number one contenders match for the tag team title. And I think if Johnson and Atlas had won, or even if the Samoans had won, that the winning team to face, Sheik and Volkov would have been really pretty awesome. I mean, I think Johnson and Atlas for Sheik and Volkov would have been a great tag team title match. I think the Samoans versus Sheik and Volkov, and for that matter, the Samoans versus Windham and Rotundo. I think the only thing that would have been probably against the norm for WWF would have been Johnson and Atlas versus Windham and Rotundo. That maybe would have split the audience because they were all baby faces. But I think, can you imagine Samoans challenging Volkov and Sheik, or the Samoans challenging Wyndham and Rotundo. That would have been nice. And I think Johnson and Atlas versus Volkov and the Sheik. I mean, that is box office. I mean, that's huge. So they didn't do that. Of course, they gave us Jimmy Hart and King Kong Bundy versus S.T. Jones for 6 seconds instead. But in any event, I mean, I'm just having fun. And then what was my final thing here? Um, yeah, the Hart Foundation versus the Bulldogs. Like I said, those teams weren't really together quite yet, so you can't really blame them. But the Magnificent Morocco stuff, Morocco versus either Johnson or Pedro, either way to build up Morocco. Well, that's it, folks. I mean, we've had some fun here. Like I said, I do appreciate the subscribers. My buddy Laza, who's a great subscriber, he subscribes not only to this channel, but to one Mike Messier. He had a nice comment on my sleeping on the job video. I do have basically like four YouTube channels now. There's this one Pro Wrestling and Sports Fan, which is pro wrestling and sports stuff. We have one Mike Messier, which is Mike's Instant Movie Reviews. We have one Artist Mike Messier, which is my wonderful art. Okay. And then we do have One Man and a Camera Films, One Man and a Camera Films, which is my fantastic film work. So all these wonderful things. You should subscribe to all these channels. You should go to Spreadshirt, look for the foreign object, lowercase, buy one of these wonderful t-shirts that I'm wearing. You can even get this on a hat. You can get it on a jacket. You can do all these wonderful things. You can go to MikeMessier.com, scroll to the bottom, and buy my books, for Christ's sakes. But this is it, folks. So, I mean, if you have any comments or queries or questions, you can leave a comment. You can leave a question. You can tell me how great I am. I do accept accolades. And that's it. So I think I'm going to go to sleep because now it's 4:21. Got a minute? And I'll sleep knowing that I did a wonderful video for you people. And you can subscribe. You can share this video. You can put this on Reddit. Tell me how wonderful I am and all that good stuff. But if you have any suggestions for future videos, this is what you would call an evergreen video. This is a video that's not really dependent on time. I'm not discussing the latest and greatest pay-per-view of the weekend or whatever. I'm discussing something of historical interest to historical wrestling fans. Like I said, thanks to all the new subscribers, all the old subscribers. Share the videos. It's your buddy Mike Messier saying good night or good day or good life, whatever. Thanks.